After the military coup in Egypt, the army chief seeks a mandate from the people, calling for mass rallies to back a crackdown on what he's calling terrorism and violence. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. From the Arab Spring and Egypt's first freely elected civilian president to a military overthrow, now the army's calling on the people to take to the streets. Egypt's path towards political transition has taken an even more challenging series of twists and turns, and raising the question of whether what happened at the outset was indeed a revolution or rather an uprising. General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has asked for a mass turnout in Friday rallies to give the army a mandate to do what it sees as necessary to stamp out violence, setting a collision course with supporters of former President Mohamed Morsi.
Are you willing to destroy the country in order to rule it? Would that be religious? Are you willing to ruin the army or have it on your side? It's not possible. It's a very grave matter. I urge all Egyptians to go to the streets on Friday to give me a mandate to counter violence and terrorism. This is a request to all Egyptians to show the whole world that the Egyptian people have a will and have a say.
Well, opponents have described Sisi's comments as a call to war.
Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who claimed in his first statement that he had to remove the elected president in a military coup to escape a national conflict and civil war, is now calling for a civil war himself to protect his military coup. He is proving that he is the actual president for the country and that the president, his vice president and the government do not actually hold any power.
Supporters of Mohamed Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood have held daily protests since he was removed from office by the army earlier this month. At least 100 people have been killed in fights with security forces since then. Egypt's interim president, Adli Mansour, has outlined a timetable which envisages changes to the constitution and a referendum, paving the way for elections early next year. But can there be national unity between groups with such widely differing ideologies and values? And are revolutions enough to achieve democracy? In our London studios, Sabah El-Mukhtar, president of the Arab Lawyers Association. Here in Doha, Zakaryya Abdel-Hady, assistant professor of Islamic thought and culture at Qatar University. And also in London, Azzam Tamimi, director of the Institute of Islamic Political Thought. Welcome to you all. To begin, I'd just explain that we do not have guests from Cairo in the show because our service providers in Egypt were informed by the authorities that they could not provide facilities to the Al Jazeera network for what were called security reasons. But on with the show, let's start with Zakaryya Abdel-Hady. Both sides claim to be fighting for democracy in Egypt. Is either side right?
Well, it's a first hi to all your guests from London and from everywhere. Let me just make it very clear that this is not two sides fighting over democracy. It is one side that are fighting and dying for democracy that have been dreaming for the last 60 years, and there is another side who want to kill democracy, who destroyed all the votes that people have been voting for over the last couple of years. People voted for presidential election, they cancelled that. The people voted for parliament, they cancelled that. People voted for shura, people voted for the constitution, and all this were democratic process. And suddenly all of this has gone out of the window, and suddenly we have the military back again after just 1 year break. For 6 years we have been having them, and now they are back. So it is a fight between people who are pro-democracy, people who want democracy, and people who want the military regime back again.
Well, Azzam Tamimi, your view on that particular point?
Well, I fully agree. And from my point of view and from my perspective here in London, what's going on in Egypt is not an Egyptian affair. There are so many parties involved, people from the Arab region, from the Gulf region, probably the United States of America, who was given the green light to the coup against democracy. This is actually a war against the Arab Spring. This is an attempt to abort the Arab Spring, because there are still regimes in the region who are terrified that the Spring might reach their borders. The fight for democracy in Egypt today is a fight for human dignity across the Arab region.
Well, let's be very clear what those who support the military action have been saying. They believe that the government in place was acting undemocratically and they needed to be removed, and hence they supported the military action. But Saba Al-Mukhtar in London, your view on this issue?
Well, they may be right in their criticism of the government, but that is not the solution. The immorality and the unethical position which the United Nations, Secretary General, the Western powers, the Europeans, the Americans have taken under the circumstances, we have a situation where there is clearly a coup d'etat against a democratically elected government. It doesn't matter, people do not like it, probably it wasn't an efficient government, there are maybe a lot of criticism, but that is not how you deal with an elected government. The problem is that we have two sides who are have kept quiet on this one. One is the international community. It is really disturbing that nobody in Europe, in the USA, in the United Nations, in the Human Rights Council, and all these international institutions, and indeed among the liberals, the leftists, the Nasserists, the Baathists, all those people who are in Egypt, who have actually not said that this is a coup d'etat, while it is for all intents and purposes, by every definition of a coup d'etat, this is precisely what it is. And it is not possible that the world can actually keep quiet about this situation, and that is where the test comes in, and at the same time, in the same breath, talk about democracy in other countries. What messages are we sending to democracies, to the people who are rising against their leaderships, against the dictatorship in their countries, when at the end of the day, once that dictatorship goes, and they come into power by democratically elected, and through the normal process of democracy and election, the army can come and take over. This is really a very disturbing message that we are sending to the world.
Well, Saba Al-Mukhtar, many of those who may well follow the military's call and take to Tahrir Square in demonstrations Friday are those who were in the square when Hosni Mubarak was deposed. Many of them would characterize them as liberals, as moderates, fighting for democracy. Why this turnaround in the position of those who define themselves as liberal moderates in the past?
Well, unfortunately, this is why I personally feel very distressed about this one, because I consider myself to be one of them. But at the same time, what I do not understand is this change of view because of the hatred they had toward the Muslim Brotherhood, the people who won the election. I think the reason for that is that the nationalist movement, the leftist movement, the socialists, and all those liberals have, at the end of the day, have seen that in fact they have no backing in the street, and they became absolutely bad losers. They wouldn't accept the result of the ballot box under the pretext that it is the people who wants the change. And this is absolutely stupid, the idea that now the military ruler of Egypt, Sisi, calls for people to go out in the street. This is not how you run government. This is not how you run even a coup d'etat. This is a situation.
Let me go to Zakaryya Abdel-Hady on that particular point. For those who, once again, I say, define themselves as liberals, it would appear that the ballot box was not enough.
I mean, I said it once before on Al Jazeera, is that unfortunately the opposition of Morsi at that time, instead of them working very hard, as the Muslim Brotherhood have worked very hard over the last 80 years to work on the ground with the people and provide them their needs and to show that they are with them day and night. The opposition, unfortunately, at that time, what they were doing is that they were just creating chaos for Morsi and his government. And instead of that, they build in the locality and they work with the people to show that they can provide them with something. They kept being failure from one failure to another. So the only opportunity for them to come to power was over the tanks. And unfortunately, this was what they did. I had so much hope on the opposition, because the opposition, they were intelligent people. They were people who were calling for democracy. But to accept to come on the tank, that was a disaster. And this is what we have seen in this illegal government that Hazm al-Biblawi is running. This illegal government with its illegal president, we have 10 of its ministers who are Mubarak old regime. 10 of its ministers. In it there is around 9 of its ministers who are from the opposition party, who could not win any of those seats, who could not win governments, who could not win. Now they are represented in this government over the tanks. So when you have a scenario like that, a scene like that, those people who just here because they want some seats, and the only way they can get those seats on top of the tanks, this is a failure for democracy that they've been claiming. And now, for me, what I see about pro-democracy people are those people who are out in the street, in Rabaa and in other places, who are saying, no, we're not going to go back to military. The military cannot lead us. The military is there to defend the country, but not to be a political player. And this is what we have seen it in a very stupid act by the generals when they announced yesterday. They came in public and they said, we are the one who are running the affairs. The president didn't make any statement, the prime minister didn't make any statement, and the minister of defense, who is the deputy of the prime minister, came in the TV and he said, I'm asking everybody to walk in the streets. This is a disaster.
Well, Azzam Tamimi, if I may go to you on this particular issue, is there a confusion perhaps about what democracy is? Is the concept itself something new to the people of Egypt? Is the belief that popular dissent in the streets can actually replace the electoral process part of a lack of knowledge about what democracy really means?
Well, after 25th January revolution, everybody wanted democracy because they knew what autocracy and despotism was about. They had suffered for 60 years under military dictatorship. Initially, everybody knew that democracy meant that the people choose and the majority vote is decisive. However, the bad losers have started or have embarked on a campaign to convince the public that this was not what democracy was about, that democracy is not about the ballot box. They started coming up with completely new definitions, sometimes ridiculous definitions, about national consensus, and which doesn't exist anywhere in the world, about counting the heads in the streets, which is ridiculous because that doesn't work in practice anywhere. So democracy has really one definition. Differences among people within human communities exist on all sorts of issues. We can settle these differences in a civilized manner by going to the ballot boxes, by having agendas and programs of political parties, and people compete to win the hearts and the minds of the voters for them, or we can fight each other until we finish each other in a very uncivilized manner. I think democracy has one definition and it has only one way, and the coup perpetrators and their allies, who allied themselves, by the way, with some of the most despotic and corrupt regimes in the Arab world, want to convince the public that democracy is something completely different.
Well, let's just take a pause here and look at one particular issue. Egypt's transition has been likened to shaking the foundations of the old regime without dismantling it. That would require structural change that some argue has been prevented by what has been called the deep state. But what is the deep state? The police are said to be one part. Their leadership hasn't changed since the revolution, and some have accused them of working against Mohamed Morsi by not fully deploying during his presidency. The judiciary could be another. Many of the country's senior judges were appointed during the Mubarak era. And then corruption within the state bureaucracy could be another issue. And in the private sector, many business elites are still aligned with the old Mubarak regime. And that includes a hostile media establishment that has generally shown itself to be anything but partial. Given all of this, would it be correct to characterize the deposing of Mubarak as a revolution, or is it rather an uprising in which the head was removed, leaving the body intact? Your view, Azzam Tamimi.
Well, you are right in that, and it's a very valid question, because many people now are saying the reason actually Mohamed Morsi could do very little in terms of resolving many of the problems of the country is that the main institutions of the state were not helping, were not cooperating, were completely against him. We knew the police was against him, we knew that the mukhabarat was against him, we knew that the media was completely against him, we knew that the judiciary was against him, and now we discover that the army, which he thought was with him, is completely against him. So I think now many people are rethinking the entire picture, coming to conclusion that probably this was designed right from the start in order to keep the roots and the body of the Mubarak regime while changing probably the facade from the outside.
Well, Zakaryya Abdel-Hady, do you believe that? Do you agree with that, that there was some deep long-term strategy involved during the time that Mohamed Morsi's government was in power?
Absolutely. I totally agree with Dr. Azzam in what he said. And in fact, if you look at the scenarios that was happening in Egypt during the one-year Morsi period, from day one, once it was known that it was either Shafiq or Morsi who were be running for president, when they were both the high people had voted for them the highest. People, there was some notion, why don't Morsi withdraw and let somebody else come in power? So there are people who are trying to push Morsi out from the window from the beginning. And then suddenly we realized that there was, of course, a dramatic, deep-rooted Mubarak regime that still exists. And whenever Morsi was trying to remove part of it, he was faced with so much huge criticism in the media, shouting, where is the freedom, where is, and suddenly we didn't hear any of this once after the coup, when the channel, TV channel was closed, Al Jazeera channel self-offices was closed. All this were not mentioned at all. So there was, of course, deep-rooted Mubarak regime, and one of its strongest was, of course, in the judiciary system, when they have destroyed the hope of people. I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes. I had my father and mother who are older generation, and we have thousands and millions of people in Egypt who were standing there in the queue to vote for a parliament, which they saw that it would be representing them. And after over 30 million voters stood there day and night to vote and cast a vote, suddenly the judges, the corrupted judges that belongs to Mubarak regime, and who are now sending free the old regime. They send Ahmed Izz out, they send Jamal out, they're sending them all out and freeing them from prison and putting the people of the revolution in prison. They came and cancelled the elected parliament.
Well, let's just go on at this particular point to Sabah al-Nokta to follow on something what you're saying there, Azzam Tamimi. Is there a danger that those who took part in all those electoral processes in Egypt from the time that Mubarak was deposed are going to be disillusioned with the process, having seen the elected government, a constitution that was publicly endorsed, both being removed by yet another military takeover? Is this a real danger?
Well, the danger is, in the first instance, I think, the presumption that the Egyptian people are accustomed to the workings of democracy, having a deep understanding of the processes and how it works and what does it mean to be on the losing side, and how do you settle differences and how do you go to the ballot box. To presume that the Egyptian people have this, I think it is probably not correct. The Egyptian people as a nation and as people, they haven't practiced this for probably in the last century, if not more before. So to expect them suddenly to change is not correct. The second thing, I think the idea that the disillusionment, this is certainly going to happen, because the presumption again that democracy equals election i.e. once you have election, that means you have democracy, is not correct. And people in Egypt and indeed in the various Arab countries are of the opinion, because the West is telling them this. The USA policy, the Western policy, all what they talk about is to have elections. So they make the simple people, whether they are in Africa or Asia and the Arabs or whatever, believe that if you just have election, then you have a democracy and you have a democratic system. And this is actually not correct. This is where we are misleading people into that situation. And then after that, we complain that this regime is not democratic or democratic, and the position that the West and the USA and the international community has taken in respect of the coup d'etat in Egypt is really a vindication of what I'm saying. But certainly the result of that, the people in the first instance had to really, as our colleague has just said, that they had to queue for days to vote, because they thought that if they vote, if they take part, then that's it. They have a democracy in the country. Those people are going to say, what is the point in doing that? And even those who will still believe in that one will say, what is the point in doing that when you have all the nationalists, the Nasserists, the leftists, the communists, and all the rest of them, and indeed even the Western democracies, are saying, well, maybe the army in its action has been responding to the people, which is really a very bad move. And it gives clearly the wrong signals. And the idea at the end of the day of this coup d'etat in Egypt, I think nobody has benefited from it more than Israel, because the USA have now suspended the supply of the F-16s. And F-16s to Egypt is nothing to do with the democratic process, with the demonstrations, with the civilian population, with Morsi or with Sisi. It is directed principally at defending Egypt against the possible problems with Israel. Now that thanks to the army takeover, the USA has found the reason to say, well, we will suspend the arms supply to Egypt on this respect.
Well, everybody seems to be losing this particular point. But that leads to another issue, Azzam Tamimi, and that is the question, are people defining democracy what they want it to be rather than what it is? Is that part of the fundamental issues that we are seeing in Egypt?
Well, you see, if you don't like the result of democracy and you cannot be patient for another round, you cannot wait for it, then you'll probably start complaining and saying this is not what I thought democracy was about. But strictly speaking, technically, democracy is defined as a set of procedures, measures, and checks and balances. The culmination of all of this is going to the ballot boxes. Of course, you have to have an independent judiciary, you have to have the rule of the law, you have to have all the security agencies and the army completely out of the political process in order to guarantee that there is no influence from these powerful agencies. But what we see in Egypt is not because the Egyptians don't understand what democracy is about or don't know how to practice democracy. Here we have a conspiracy. This is a grand conspiracy. I'm not talking here about conspiracy theory. I'm talking about a plot. I'm talking about billions of dollars paid by the UAE and Saudi Arabia and to some extent Kuwait. I'm talking about American green light. I'm talking about all the liberals and the socialists and the Nasserists coming together in order to abort a democratic process that has proven that the Islamists are more popular in the Arab world than anybody else. This is what we are seeing in Egypt.
Well, very quickly, a final word from Zakaryya Abdel-Hady, and that is in response to what has just been said there. Is what happening in Egypt a result of people trying to not allow it succeed?
Yeah, that is absolutely true. Let me make it very clearly. What's happening in Egypt is not people who are two groups fighting against one another. It's one main group who are fighting for democracy. They have been there from day one. They have been elected. They have been fighting for democracy. And in fact, I have a lot of friends who were actually against Morsi. And after Sisi's speech yesterday, they said, no, we are going to go walk in the street and say, no, we are here for democracy, and we are going to be with the democracy, and we are not going to allow the military to interfere. Another important point is that, in my personal opinion, people will always win. Whether you have the tanks, whether you have the guns, whether you have the machine guns, people will always prevail.
Well, at that point, we will say thank you to our guests.
Thank you.
Sabah El Mukhtar, Zakaryya Abdel-Hady, and Azzam Tamimi. And a reminder that we were unable to bring any guests from Cairo because the authorities refused to allow our provider to provide facilities. But don't forget, you can find this program and many more at aljazeera.com. Just click on shows and Inside Story, and you can add to the discussion at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.